Lincoln Death Train. I'd been transferred to the Hudson Division of the New York Central System and was working the rails on the main line between New York and Albany. I was on the late shift to start with, since I was a bit of a night owl. After 6 weeks of stomping the tracks and mending the rails, I was feeling right at home in my new job. Then, just before midnight on a clear spring night in late April, we got a report of some brush on the track near our station. I was sent out immediately to clear it away before the next train came. I had nearly an hour before the next train, and so I did not hurry as I walked along the rails. It was surprisingly pleasant and rather warm. Overhead, the clouds were obscuring the moon, but the light from my lantern made a cheerful glow in the night. Suddenly, a chilly wind swept over the rails with a whoosh, like a wind just before a thunderstorm. It was so strong that it nearly knocked me over. I staggered backward, swearing and windmilling my arms to try to keep my balance. I almost dropped the lantern, but managed to get my balance just before it slipped out of my hand. Shivering in the sudden cold, I squinted down the track and saw a huge blanket of utter darkness rolling toward me. It blanked out the rails, the trees, the sky, everything. Good Lord, what is that? I gasped. I leapt away from the track and started to run back toward the station, but the darkness swept up and over me before I had moved a yard. The lantern in my hand was snuffed out instantly. I stopped, unable to see more than a few paces around me. To my right, the rails began to gleam with a strange blue light. I staggered backwards from the tracks, my pulses pounding in fear and dread. What was going on? Then the headlight of a train pierced the thick darkness. It gleamed blue-white in the strange black fog, and when it appeared, the rails brightened in response. A huge steam engine draped in black crepe approached, stacks bellowing forth a steady stream of smoke. The brass on the engine gleamed, and it pulled several flat cars along behind it. I stared into the windows of the engine, but couldn't see any crew. Just at the edge of hearing came the faint sound of music and turned to look at the flat cars behind the engine. I gasped and backed up so far that I bumped into the trunk of a tree growing near the tracks. There was a glowing orchestra of skeletons seated in a semicircle. They were playing a nearly soundless funeral dirge on glowing black instruments. A violinist played passionately, a skeleton lifted a flute to its lipless mouth, a lone drummer sat waiting patiently for his cue from the skeletal conductor. Then the orchestra was gone and another glowing headlight pierced the blackness. I was trying unsuccessfully to push my way through the bark of the tree by this time. Another black crepe-draped train was approaching. A funeral train, I thought. Again, there was no one manning the engine, and no one appeared on the flat car behind it. The only thing there was a single black crepe-draped coffin. But swirling in the air around the train were the ghostly figures of soldiers dressed in the blue uniforms worn by the North during the Civil War. They lined up before my eyes, saluting the solitary coffin as it passed. Some of the ghosts staggered under the weight of their own coffins, some limped on one leg or sat in a wheelchair, legless. Their eyes were fixed upon the flat car and the black crepe coffin. Then they were joined by soldiers from the Southern Army, and all these lads saluted too, honoring the one who had fallen. That's when I knew what I was seeing. This was the funeral train of Abraham Lincoln. I straightened up and saluted myself, having done my bit for the North many years ago. The steam train moved slowly away, and with it went the darkness and the chill and the clouds that had obscured the moon. In my hand, the lantern sprang back to life. I blinked a few times and brushed away a tear. As the world around me brightened, I saw the reported brush littering the tracks right in front of me. Mechanically, I cleared it away and made sure the track was safe for the next train. Then I went back to the station. The next morning, all the clocks on the Hudson Division were 6 minutes behind, and all the trains were running 6 minutes late. When I asked the station master about it, he shook his head and told me not to worry. It was caused by the Lincoln Death Train, which had stopped time as it ran by in the night. Lorona, omen of death. They say that the Lorona was once a poor young girl who loved a rich nobleman, and together they had 3 children. The girl wished to marry the nobleman, but he refused her. He told her that he might have considered marrying her if she had not borne the 3 out-of-wedlock children, which he considered a disgrace. The girl was determined to have the nobleman for her own, so she drowned her children to prove her love to him. But still he would have none of her and married another. Mad with grief, the girl walked along the river, weeping and calling for her children. But they were gone. So she drowned herself. For her crime, her spirit was condemned to wander the waterways, weeping and searching for her children until the end of time. It was said that whenever the wailing woman appears, someone will die. Now I have heard that one night, 2 young men were carpooling home from work with the windows down when they heard a terrible wail. It sounded like the desperate cry of a baby or perhaps an injured tomcat. Beside the road, a white mist began to gather. It moved swiftly among a grove of palm trees, and when it reached the largest tree, it became the figure of a lovely young girl dressed all in white. Long dark hair hung loose down her back. She began to weep and wring her hands in agony, and the men realized that they were seeing the ghost of the Lorona. The driver gunned the engine and they drove away as fast as they could. The glowing figure of the Lorona remained visible in the rearview mirror until the car turned the corner. The men were upset by the vision, afraid that the rumors about the Lorona might be true. But nothing happened to either of them the rest of that night, so they laughed away the incident, deciding that they had imagined the whole thing. The next night, the men were riding home from work when their front tire burst at the place in the road where they had seen the ghost the previous night. The car spun out of control and hit the largest tree in the palm grove in the exact place where the Lorona had appeared to them. Both men were killed instantly. Lost. They say that there once was a prospector wandering through the Yukon with his 2 dogs, searching for gold. One evening as it neared dusk, he found himself mired down in the muskeg boggy country with water just underneath the surface of the semi-frozen ground and just above the permafrost. It was a treacherous place, and would be very easy to sink beneath the surface and be engulfed. The more the prospector and his dogs tried to free themselves from its clutches, the more lost they became. Finally, the prospector found a firm spot on a small hill. There were a few scraggly trees on the elevation, and he made a small fire and cooked up a bit of soup for himself and his canine companions. As the stars came out overhead, the man tried to find a comfortable place to sleep, knowing that in the morning he and the dogs would once again face the quagmire. At last, the prospector fell into an uneasy sleep. As he slept, he dreamt that a fierce native warrior was standing over him, threatening him with a spear. "Why have you invaded this sacred ground?" the warrior demanded. "Leave at once or I will kill you." "I am lost in the muskeg," the prospector said in his dream. "Show me the way out, and I will gladly leave." The warrior frowned down at him. "I am the protector of this place, and cannot forsake it. But I will summon a guide for you." The warrior raised his arms toward the sky and called something in a tongue the prospector could not understand. Then he vanished. The prospector was awakened by the sudden growling of his dogs. Sitting up, he beheld the glowing figure of a beautiful Native American woman standing at the bottom of the hill. He blinked in amazement and felt chills run all over his body. The woman beckoned to him, and to his surprise, his dogs ceased their growling and ran up to her. They pranced around her like pups, and he felt his fear fade away. Packing up his gear, the prospector made his way down the darkened hillock to the treacherous muskeg that surrounded it. The glowing woman smiled at him. She raised her arms in the same gesture used by the warrior in his dream and transformed into a beautiful snow-white hare. The glowing hare hopped slowly ahead of the prospector, leading him eastward. The prospector followed it closely, deviating neither left nor right from its path. The dogs followed him eagerly and showed no interest in chasing the hare. For several hours, the prospector and his dogs followed the glowing animal through the treacherous twists and turns of the quagmire. Just before dawn, they reached solid ground. The prospector looked around and knew where he was. Ahead of him, the white hair became once more the beautiful, glowing figure of a woman. The dogs danced up to her, and she patted them on the head. Then she offered the prospector a sweet smile and vanished as the first rays of the sun pierced the horizon. Mako Ghost Light. There was once a railroad conductor named Joe Baldwin who was working for the newly rebuilt Atlantic Coast Line. The year was 1867, and the railroad had expanded to include a small station in Mako, North Carolina. Joe was assigned to the very last car in the train, and he executed his conductor duties to the best of his abilities aboard his assigned car. Then one night, something went wrong. Terribly wrong. The train was heading down the line toward the tiny Mako station when Joe's car started to slow down dramatically. Worried, Joe went forward to see what was happening and realized that his car had come decoupled from the rest of the train. Joe's heart leapt into his throat when he saw the retreating lights of the train disappearing into the distance. His car was stuck on the tracks, and another train was following close behind them. With a shout of dismay, Joe grabbed his signal lantern and frantically ran the length of the car. Bursting out of the back door, he ran out on the rear platform. Yes, he could see the next train speeding toward them down the track. By the look of it, the engineer had not realized the danger. Joe leaned over the rail, desperately signaling for the engineer in the following train to stop. But the train barreled forward, speed unabated. Joe realized that the engineer must not have seen his signal light or perhaps had not realized its significance. He kept waving the lantern frantically from side to side, shouting in vain over the huge rumbling force of the oncoming train. The engine grew larger and larger, and Joe's heart was in his throat as he realized the train was not going to stop. With a thunderous roar and the great shriek of massive metal hitting massive metal, the engine struck the helpless car. Joe, still at his post, was smashed between the two trains. His head was severed from his body. The signal lantern flew wildly out of his hand, rolling along beside the tangled metal of the two trains and miraculously flipping upright, still alight. Joe's was the only fatality in the railway accident that night. The railroad officials never located his head. Shortly after the train accident, the Mako light began to appear on the tracks near the station. People traveling on the train or crossing the tracks at Mako would report a light shining in the distance when no train was due. The light would appear as a small ball far down the tracks, and then would come closer and closer to the observer until it was the size of a lantern. People reported that the light moved back and forth frantically, as if it were signaling a train to stop, just as Joe Baldwin had done the night of the accident. The phenomenon became so common that the Atlantic Coast Line Railroad ordered their engineers not to stop for the light if they saw it as they were approaching Mako. Folks believed it was the spirit of Joe Baldwin, the conductor, desperately replaying his final moments over and over again, trying to get the following train to stop before it hit his helpless car. McLaughlin's Ghost. Dr. John McLaughlin came to the Pacific Northwest with the Hudson Bay Company and fell in love with the area. After losing his job, he was fired for giving supplies to settlers. He bought land in the Willamette Valley and founded the town now known as Oregon City. McLaughlin divided up the land into 300 plots which he gave to the poor and needy who had traveled west, searching for a new home. He later was elected mayor of the city. Oregon City became the destination of choice for many of the folks traveling on the Oregon Trail. When McLaughlin House was opened to the public as a museum, it swiftly became clear that someone was haunting the building. People began seeing a shadowy figure walking along the hallway and entering the room where John McLaughlin once slept. The smell of tobacco smoke sometimes permeates this smoke-free building, and it was commonly known that McLaughlin was a smoker. And sometimes footsteps sound in the corridor upstairs when no one is in the building. Perhaps McLaughlin returns occasionally to check up on his old home? Milk bottles. She was just another poor, bedraggled woman struggling to feed her family. He saw them all the time, their faces careworn and blank. The depression had created hundreds of them. He was one of the lucky ones who still had his grocery and money coming in to feed his family. She came one day to his shop, carrying 2 empty milk bottles, and wordlessly placed them on the counter in front of him. He took the empties and replaced them with full bottles, saying, "10 cents, please." She did not reply. She just took the bottles and left the shop. He might have gone after her to demand his money or called the police, but he did neither. Her need was in her face, and he always felt a little guilty at being one of the lucky ones with money and a job. She was probably one of the migrant workers, he decided. She was back the next day with 2 empty milk bottles. He replaced them with full bottles and watched as she hurried out the door. She looked so worried that he wondered if she had a job at all. If she came back, he would offer her a part-time position cleaning the store. She came again the next morning and exchanged her empty bottles for full without saying a word. He tried to talk to her, to ask if she wanted a job, but she practically ran from the store with the milk. Her urgency worried him. He followed, wondering what he could do to help. To his surprise, she headed away from the migrant camp outside of town. She went instead to the graveyard by the river. As he watched, she hurried up to a stone marker and then disappeared into the ground. He rubbed his eyes in disbelief. Then he heard the muffled cry of a baby. It was coming from the ground underneath the stone marker where the woman had disappeared. He ran back to the store and phoned the police. Within minutes, the graveyard was swarming with people, and the workers started digging up the grave. When the casket was opened, the store owner saw the woman who had visited his store lying dead within it. In her arms, she held a small baby and 2 full milk bottles. The baby was still alive. Mal de Gros. Mal de Gros was a wicked witch who once lived on Gully Road in what is now Newark, New Jersey. She took delight in the misery of others and made things miserable for the folks living near her. If a neighbor slighted her, she would sour their milk. If anyone called her a witch, she made their dogs turn vicious. People were very cautious around Mal de Gros. When a new family moved in, their grown-up son took offense with the witch's rude behavior toward his mother and told her off. That night, an evil black dog with glowing red eyes emerged from the woods in front of his horse. The horse bolted and the dog raced after it, leaping up to bite at his tail and sides. The young man was struck by a low-hanging branch and fell lifeless to the ground. The hound howled once in triumph and then disappeared in a puff of acrid smoke, leaving the terrified horse to walk trembling back to its dead master and stand guard until his body was found. Folks put up with Mal de Gros for many years. But then there came a rash of unexplained infant deaths. People soon realized that Mal de Gros had a grudge against each of the families that had lost a child. When she was accused by a hysterical mother of causing the death of her baby girl, Mal de Gros just laughed and didn't deny it. This was the last straw for the local residents. They formed a mob and went to Gully Road to burn the witch to death. But when they reached her house, Mal de Gros was already dead, sitting bolt upright in her chair with a cruel smile on her lifeless face. Mal de Gros was buried in the Mount Prospect Cemetery on Gully Road, and her malicious ghost continued to haunt the place long after her body turned to dust.